All right, here's our story for today. Buddy and his wife Edna went to the state fair every year. And every year Buddy would say, "Edna, I'd like to ride in that helicopter there." Edna always replied, "I know, Buddy, but that helicopter ride is $50, and $50 is $50. One year Buddy and Edna went to the fair, and Buddy said, "Edna, I'm 85 years old now. If I don't ride that helicopter, I may never get another chance." To this, Edna replied, "Buddy, that helicopter ride is $50, and $50 is $50. The pilot overheard the couple and said, "Folks, I'll make you a deal. I'll take you both of you for a ride, and if you can stay quiet the entire ride and don't say a word, I won't charge you a penny. But if you say one word, it's $50. Buddy and Edna agreed, and up they went. The pilot did all kinds of fancy maneuvers, but not a word was heard. He did his daredevil tricks over and over again, but still not a word. When they landed, the pilot turned to Buddy and said, "By golly, I did everything I could to get you to yell out, but you didn't. I'm impressed." Buddy replied, "Well, I tell you the truth, I almost said something when Edna fell out, but you know, $50 is $50. No one respects women more than I do. Last week, we looked at the story of David in the Old Testament, a teenager, this young boy who found himself suddenly on the battlefield facing a fearsome enemy, thought he was bringing food to his brothers, winds up in the battlefield, and relied on his faith and his very unique gifts, talents, to defeat the giant Goliath. Today, a much different character and a much different turning point. I'm going to show you a clip. We haven't looked at Braveheart in a while, but there's a clip from Braveheart where, you know the story, William Wallace is the Scottish hero, and he's leading a revolt against English forces that are occupying Scotland, and he's fighting against King Edward I of England, nicknamed Longshanks due to his unusual height. And as Wallace wins skirmish after skirmish against English forces, Longshanks becomes more and more concerned about this revolution taking place around him and more desperate to eliminate William Wallace. Well, in the scene you're going to look at now, Longshanks returns from a trip to France and finds that his son is incompetent and his son's friend, and they discover Wallace has won a decisive battle in York, and we watch the aftermath of that. So let's watch the scene.
It's not your fault. Stand up to him.
I will stand up to him and more.
What news of the North?
Nothing new, Your Majesty. We've sent riders to speed any word.
I heard the word in France, where I was fighting to expand your future kingdom. The word, my son, is that our entire northern army is annihilated. And you have done nothing.
I have ordered conscriptions. They're assembled and ready to depart.
Excuse me, sire, but there's a very urgent message from York.
Come. Leave us.
Thank you, sire.
Wallace has sacked York.
Huh?
Wallace has sacked York.
Sire, their own nephew. What beast could do such a thing?
If he can sack York, he can invade your England.
We would stop him.
Who is this person who speaks to me as though I needed his advice?
I have declared Philip my High Counselor.
Is he qualified?
I am skilled in the arts of war and military tactics, sire.
Are you? And tell me, what advice would you offer on the present situation?
Who is this? You knew he was in trouble right about that point. Well, the point of that little clip is that it can be dangerous to be in the presence of an angry king. And we see that here in the story we're going to look at today. A little background before we look at the story. Remember Moses, whose story we looked at, his turning point was responding to the call of God, led the people up to the promised land, but not into it. Joshua, the next leader, a younger man, we looked at his turning point. He trusted God entirely and led the people into the promised land. Then Israel was led for decades by a series of what the Bible calls judges. These combination of priests and prophets and warriors who led them. The last judge is a man named Samuel. But then the people start clamoring for a king. All the pagan nations around them have kings to lead them, and they want a king. God tries to warn them through Samuel what can happen, that kings aren't always good news, but they still want a king. And so Saul is anointed the first king of Israel. The Bible tells us that Saul is head and shoulders taller than any other man in Israel, that he's an outstanding warrior, so he's sort of perfect. He fits the description of a king. He becomes king when he's 30 years old, reigns over Israel for 42 years, says the Old Testament. Now, you do need to know that early in his career, and we're not going to read this part of the story, it's very long. Early in his career, King Saul made a couple of bad decisions that didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but they turned out to be a very big deal. His first bad decision was they got came right up to the edge of a battle against the Philistines again, and he was supposed to wait for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice to God before battle. Samuel didn't come. Saul gets impatient, so he offers to sacrifice himself instead of waiting for Samuel. And God condemns him for disobeying God's direct order. He was in a hurry, did it his way. And then another time in the battle, God told him, when you destroy this enemy, you have to destroy everything. You have to destroy all their loot, everything. You can't keep anything for yourself. But Saul, in the process of winning the battle, saw that this people group had a lot of valuable things, and so he kept some of the loot for himself instead of destroying it. God again said, you've disobeyed me, you didn't follow my command exactly. So the result of all that was that the Lord withdrew his favor from Saul at some point early in his reign as king. Then comes the story of David and Goliath, which we looked at last week. David becomes famous almost overnight, and Saul, King Saul, doesn't like that very much. So here we read the story. You look in your booklets. We're in session 9 today. We flip-flop 9 and 10. 1 Samuel 1, chapter 18. When the men were returning home after David killed the Philistine, the giant, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, with timbrels and lyres, because they just won the battle, right? As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me only with thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. Let me pause there. You might be going like, whoa, what does that mean? Evil spirit from the Lord? What does that mean? It doesn't seem to make sense. Well, the Bible teaches and sort of assumes that God has an enemy. His enemy's name is Satan, which means one who opposes. Satan is a created being. Scholars believe Satan was an angel of light that was cast out of heaven because he was proud and set himself against God the Father. Satan first shows up in our Bibles in the Garden of Eden, right in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. And he sets himself against God. We see him then again in the book of Job. We're going to look at Job's story in a few weeks, where we learn that God allows Satan certain limited freedoms to attack the man Job. So Satan is a limited being. He's evil and against God, but God is restraining the level of evil Satan can perpetrate in the world. So here we can assume that this evil spirit is allowed by God to harass Saul because Saul has turned away from God. This is sort of the Bible's way of talking about Saul is slowly kind of losing it as king. Now it's likely that this is just a part of God's judgment on Saul for his disobedience. So it says he was prophesying in his house. This means doesn't mean he was giving a sermon. It means he was kind of talking like a crazy man. While David was playing the lyre, which is a musical instrument, David was a great musician, as he usually did, Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." And David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him a command over 1,000 men. David led the troops in their campaigns. Now there may be Saul was hoping David's going to get killed in battle. We don't really know. In everything he did, he had a great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. Here's a question we'll deal with later. Why was Saul afraid of David because of success? What was it about David's success that made Saul afraid? Verse 16, but all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Okay, let's try to make sense of this story. I don't think I've ever taught a lesson on King Saul before, but here's what I see. First, King Saul abdicated his responsibility. We see in the stories he abdicated his responsibility. You've probably seen the stories coming out this fall, maybe late summer, throughout the fall, about the Baylor football program. Their coach, Art Briles, wildly successful at Baylor over the last number of years, but was terminated before this season began because of a series of sexual assault cases that were coming to light, including an accusation of gang rape against football players at Baylor. And evidently, the coach Briles knew something about what's going on. The accusations came to his office, and he just kind of turned a blind eye and focused on football and did nothing about it. In that sense, he abdicated his responsibility. You also may have seen the stories about Louisville basketball coach Rick Pitino, where strippers and prostitutes were provided for recruits over the years when they visited campus. And he claims to know nothing about it. One of his low-level assistants set it all up, and he's distanced himself from it. At the least, you could say, he abdicated responsibility for his own program. Both cases of those coaches are similar to what happens here. King Saul failed to lead early in his career when he disobeyed God in those battles. See, he had a tendency to want to do it his way. God said, you wait for Samuel to come offer an appropriate sacrifice. Saul's, I'm in a hurry. I got to do this now. I can't wait for Samuel. I'll do it myself. God says, destroy everything when you win this battle. Saul says, but there's some valuable stuff here I could use. So he keeps some stuff for himself. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is. And here I think it sounds a little familiar, at least it does to me. I think we all have a little Saul in us sometimes because we all have this bent to doing it our way. There's evidence that he even failed to lead when confronted by the Philistine giant Goliath. Remember, King Saul gave David his armor. King Saul is the tallest man in Israel. Goliath's the big giant. King Saul was the great warrior. He was the leader of the armies in the ancient way. But when David comes, this young shepherd boy, Saul gives him his armor and lets this young boy go fight his battle for him. Maybe he's hoping people will think it's him that's Saul out there in his armor, when it's really a shepherd boy. We're not sure. Anyway, it's easy to look at Coach Pitino. It's easy to look at Coach Briles. It's easy to look at Saul here and say, bad guys. Bad guys. Who would do that sort of thing? They did wrong. They didn't do the right thing. But again, I think we all have a little Saul in us. We all have this responsibility to lead. We talk about this every year at TEAM. Every man is called to lead someone. We all are given a certain amount of responsibility for our families, if you have a family, for your wives, if we're married, for our children, for our friends and neighbors. We have responsibilities in our jobs. And it's so easy, so subtle to abdicate. Because to abdicate means you don't have to really do anything awful, you just have to do nothing. That's what Longshank said to his son, you have done nothing. To do nothing is to abdicate one's responsibility. So we even see in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at King David, when he actually becomes vulnerable to the very same thing that King Saul does. David is successful early in his life, and later he has a similar thing happen to him. So Saul's responsible to lead his people toward God, to listen to and to obey God, and he fails in these instances. He abdicates that responsibility. He allows David to fight his battle, and the result, of course, is that David becomes a great hero as a young man, and Saul then becomes insanely jealous of David's success. That's the second point today. Saul becomes jealous. Did you happen to notice what the Cowboys quarterback Tony Romo did the other day? It was all over the news. Okay, he's the $1 million all-pro quarterback for America's team, Dallas Cowboys, and quite a celebrity in his own right. And he got hurt right as the season started, and this rookie steps in that nobody knew could play pro football. He was drafted highly, but a rookie named Dak Prescott steps in. And now, all of a sudden, the Cowboys are 8-1 and the best team in the NFL, and Tony Romo's now healthy again enough to play. So there's this big controversy about who's going to play quarterback, the great established star who's now healthy, or this rookie who's proved that he can play. And so everybody's wondering, what are they going to do? And Romo steps up the other day and says, basically, he's earned the right to quarterback this team. I'm his backup. I got his back, and he knows that. He basically just allowed it to happen, and you hardly ever see that in professional sports. It was astonishing what he did, his humility and his willingness to let a younger man step ahead. So let's summarize the story. So David steps onto the battlefield, takes Saul's place, defeats the giant. The women are singing his praises. They're saying David has killed his 10,000, Saul his thousands. Saul feels jealous of that. And then it says Saul is very angry because the refrain displaced him. Now, why was he angry? Saul was the one who allowed David to go out there and fight. So why is he the one angry? He said it was okay. Go out and do it. God be with you. I hope you don't wind up in a body bag. He allowed it to happen, yet he's the one who's angry. See, David becomes successful overnight. Saul is angry because he's jealous, because he wanted the acclaim for himself. He needed the attention and the worship of his own people. Saul was insecure. It's hard to imagine a king who's taller than everyone, who's got all the power, who's got all the armor, all the position, all the wealth, but he's insecure. Saul is also, evidence shows us, proud and vain. But he's already abdicated his position because he's either cowardly by letting David fight his battle, or he's simply lazy and disobedient. I mean, this would be like Joe Madden hating Chris Bryant and trying to kill him because Chris Bryant's getting all the attention for the Cubs. Makes no sense. This should have been a success Saul could have built on. He could have seen this younger man, and when he could have been mentoring, he was trying to murder this younger man. Saul was also afraid of David. It says Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. It says, so he sent David away from him, gave him a command over 1,000 men. David led the troops in their campaigns. And everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. Now, this is a whole different thing. Jealousy is one thing, but fear, why is Saul afraid of David? Wasn't David's success good for the nation? Therefore, wasn't it good for him? Because Saul's the king. This is all good stuff. Saul was afraid because he feared David was going to take his job, right? He was fearful for his position. Saul was afraid because David had something that Saul had lost, which was the favor and blessing of God. And that leads us to the third point today, that Saul, in the end, simply disobeyed God. He disobeyed. So what's the end game of abdication of responsibility? When you combine pride with jealousy and fear, what's the end game? The end game is disobedience. The end game is sin. That's what the Bible calls it. That's what led Saul to disregard God's command at several critical points in his reign. And that's what led Saul to become so paranoid about his own position and power that he tries on several occasions to kill young David. So what was Saul's turning point? We're talking about turning points. I read through this story and I'm thinking, okay, what's up with Saul? How are we like Saul? What's the turning point here? Was the turning point when he tried to pin David to the wall with his spear 2 times? I don't think so. When did the leadership go off the rails for King Saul? It wasn't when he tried to kill David with a spear. Was it when he allowed David to go out and fight Goliath in the battlefield when he should have gone out there? I don't think so. I don't think that was a turning point. I think it happened before that. I think you rewind the tape all the way. I think it started the very first time Saul chose to disregard God's instructions. He said, wait for Samuel to offer the sacrifice before you go into battle, and he was in a hurry. I gotta go do this. I can't wait and do what the Lord said. I have to do it my own way. The very first battle, that's where we see his leadership start to go off the tracks. And that's the way it works in our lives too. I think this is our application. The first decision we make, contrary to what God wants for us, seems small. It doesn't seem like a big deal. It's just a little thing. You know, I know I shouldn't watch that particular video, but it won't hurt anybody. Or I know I should provide more spiritual leadership for my family, but how many Sundays am I going to have when it's this weather and I can play golf? You know, I'll trust God in most of my life, but I'll keep this one little area just for me. That's like saying, and I'll be faithful to my wife most of the time. Okay? You get the point. Saul's turning point wasn't when he finally lost it and tried to kill David. Saul's turning point happened much, much earlier when he decided he knew better than God. That's where we have a connection with King Saul. Because as men, that's our weakness. As men, our weakness is wanting to make the decision for ourselves, wanting to make it in the most self-expedient way, wanting to hang on to our position and our power and our authority. We kind of want to be God. And so our first mistake is failing to listen to what God instructs us to do with our lives. And as such, we abdicate our responsibility. We abdicate our position. We disobey. Here's the questions I want you to deal with around your table today. There are 3 of them, and the last one is fairly personal. But the first one is, have you ever had a bad boss? I'm looking at the story, and David kind of had a bad boss. Saul's a bad boss. I think qualifies if you try to pin somebody to the wall with your spear. What made that person a poor leader, and what did you learn that you could apply to your own leadership? Now, if you're sitting at a table with your boss, choose someone else. Doesn't go so well. You ever had a bad boss? Secondly, if Saul asked you for advice, if Saul had come to you and asked for advice about the David situation, David does this great thing and he's getting all this acclaim. If Saul would ask your advice, what he should do, what advice would you have given him? Okay? Thirdly, Saul's pride and vanity, that's in my view, Saul's pride and vanity led to profound disobedience to God. Here's the question. Has pride ever been a significant issue in your life or relationships? Now, that's a personal question. And you can choose to go as far into that as you want to, or you can choose to think about it on your own. But has pride ever made a difference negatively in your relationship or in your life? So, get some coffee and you have a little more time to talk today. Wrap up right before 7 o'clock.